Congratulations on deciding that you would like to publish your research. No matter what discipline you come from, it can feel quite overwhelming to decide on which journal to submit your paper to. That's because there are so many journals to choose from. But this choice doesn't need to be overwhelming. In this video, I'll show you a few steps so that you can identify the right journal to submit your research to. Step 1 in this process is to identify journals in which your research is likely to be relevant. Here we're aiming for a handful of journals, maybe up to 3. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you ask your supervisor. Your supervisor will be a wealth of knowledge throughout the entire publication process, so of course it's no exception that they will be useful here also. Your supervisor can help you identify journals in which you should consider submitting your publication to, as well as journals in which you should avoid. Similarly, you can get quite good advice by asking your peers. Now, peers may include others in your cohort, as well as higher degree by research candidates at your university. Asking the advice of peers might uncover a few extra things that your supervisors are unaware of or just didn't enlighten you about. You may decide to use a journal finder tool to identify suitable journals. Now, here's an example using the Elsevier Journal Finder tool. Now, it's pretty simple, the web page, as most of these tools are. Generally, you input your title and abstract, like so, and they will spit out a bunch of options within that particular publication's family. So these are all Elsevier titles that might be useful, ranked in order of relevance. Here's another example, the Wiley Journal Finder tool. Again, we input our title and abstract, and it spits out a whole bunch of options that we can consider for publication. You could decide to consult Skimago to identify useful journals for you to consider. So most universities will prefer that you publish your work in Q1 journals, and Skimago ranks journals so that you can identify Q1 versus Q2 and so on. So the website looks like this, and you can either use this once you have identified a journal to check whether it's a Q1, or you can use the option to look at things like the family of categories like psychology journals, and here it ranks from highest ranking to lowest psychology journals, and you can see the Q1 is in green as opposed to journals that are Q2 or a different colour. In deciding journals that might be relevant, you could skim your reference list. The idea of skimming your reference list is if you cited a journal multiple times, that journal is likely to be interested in your similar work. So for example, here in this reference list, we can see there's a journal identified multiple times in yellow. That's probably a good one to consider publishing in. There's another one that's published multiple times here in the reference list in green. Again, if the topic's kind of similar, that journal may be interested in our work too. So now that you've got a handful of journals which might be useful, you want to make sure they're not predatory or vanity journals. Now, it's unlikely your supervisor would have suggested a predatory or vanity journal to you. It's equally unlikely you would find it through Skimago or a journal finder tool, but it's useful to know how to avoid these journals nonetheless. So vanity and predatory journals, they're not reputable, they're not legitimate options, and it'll actually not be helpful for your career to be published in one of these journals. They might appear to be peer reviewed, but they absolutely are not. So how do you identify these journals? You can consult Beall's List. Beall's List has an original and an updated list of journals which are either predatory or vanity. For example, just scrolling down to the international journals section, and you can see these look quite legitimate, but they're not. They're journals we want to avoid. Alternatively, you can choose to review the journals that are listed on the Australian Research Council page. So by choosing Evaluating Research, Excellence in Research, or something similar, you'll come across a link to Journals List, which will generally give you a downloadable file like Excel where you can identify journals in your discipline area. So here's an education example. So if the Australian Research Council has a journal listed here, then it's not likely to be a vanity or a predatory journal. The third step is to make sure that you take out of your list any journals that don't meet the submission criteria, or where your paper doesn't meet the submission criteria. So there's many things you can check here. On a journal's website, you want to peruse the About This Journal section for things like aims and scope, for calls for papers to see if there's actually a call for something in your subject space. You want to look generally in a section that looks at how to submit an article for submission criteria. Now, if you're trying to do this quite quickly, you want to have a quick skim of a journal, then the key things to look for are aims and scope, the length of paper, making sure your paper length is suitable, whether the editors prefer papers of your style. For example, if you've done a literature review, do they accept literature reviews? And if there are any costs associated. So you can see we've clicked through a few key things, lots of links, lots to read. The fourth step in deciding on a journal which might be suitable is to take any journals out of your list that you cannot afford. So many journals will have a charge for open access, which is a wonderful option because it means anyone can access your work and your work is more likely to be cited when it's easily accessible. However, these fees are often quite high. Over $3,000 is not uncommon, and so it can unfortunately limit our ability to publish in if we can't fund open access. Now, importantly, we'll see on the screen here the example from before. It says subscription has no publishing charge. Your university will have a subscription to most journals, and therefore there should be no charge for most journals that you're applying to. So of course, if you came across a journal that had a charge you couldn't afford, you can consider how you could pay that fee, or you take that journal out of your list. Step 5, we should have a bunch of journals now that we want to rank according to appropriateness. So the first thing we rank is impact factor. So impact factor is the average number of times that a journal is cited each year. So for impact factor, we can simply Google the journal name and the words impact factor. Most of the time this will give us an answer. You can alternatively look at the website for the journal and it will tell you the impact factor there. Most disciplines we're aiming for an impact factor above 1 at a minimum, but speak to your supervisor about what your discipline is looking for as a bare minimum. The next thing we want to consider in ranking journals is the acceptance rate. Again, we can simply Google the journal name and acceptance rate and we will get an answer most of the time. But if you do struggle to find an answer here, you can suspect it's probably about 15%. That's a useful number to go with. And the final thing we do in ranking journals is rank from least relevant to most relevant. And then we add up the scores we've got across those 3 measures: impact factor, acceptance rate, and relevance. And whichever has the highest number, that's where we submit our manuscript to, knowing that the second highest becomes our backup if we don't succeed with our first choice. So that was 6 simple steps to get you to submitting your manuscript and finding the journal where it's best to do so. Hope this has been helpful.